Let's continue with week 3, part 2. And we begin this one with corruption more than bribery. We now move from the ethical formation of the leader to one of the most persistent problems of public administration, corruption. And the slide immediately asks us to broaden our understanding. Corruption is not only bribery. It occurs whenever entrusted power is diverted away from its legitimate public purpose toward private or improper advantage. That definition is important because it brings us back to the concept of trust. Public power is entrusted. A budget is entrusted. Regulatory authority is entrusted. The authority to hire, promote, inspect, license, investigate, or procure is entrusted. Corruption occurs when something entrusted for a public purpose is quietly redirected toward some other purpose, sometimes toward money, sometimes toward family, sometimes toward political advantage, sometimes toward friends, sometimes toward institutional self-protection. This is why the slide gives us a much wider range of examples: kickbacks, nepotism, favoritism, patronage, ghost employees, procurement manipulation, regulatory capture, selective enforcement, influence peddling, and abuse of confidential information. Notice that some of these may occur without any cash changing hands. Suppose an official ensures that a relative is hired despite weaker qualifications. No envelope or money appears, but entrusted authority has been redirected from merit toward family advantage. That is corruption. Suppose a regulatory agency refuses to enforce rules against politically connected businesses. Again, perhaps no visible bribe exists, but public authority is being selectively exercised. That is corruption. Suppose confidential information is given to a favored bidder. Again, the Corruption Act is the diversion of entrusted access. So the deepest structure of corruption is not money. It is betrayal of public purpose. But the slide introduces an even more serious idea. Corruption can become countercultural or can become cultural. An institution may become corrupt when people gradually accept practices that they privately know are wrong. This means the true site of corruption may not be the dramatic scandal, it may be the ethical climate of the institution. What do people laugh about? What do they overlook? What do they say is normal? What practices are officially prohibited but informally expected? This is where corruption becomes phenomenological. The most dangerous stage may arrive when wrongdoing stops feeling wrong And that takes us directly to the next slide. How does an institution reach the point where wrongdoing becomes ordinary? Usually not through one dramatic act for sure, but through the normalization of small deviations. The slide describes a process that should concern every public administrator. Ethical failure rarely begins dramatically. It begins with small deviations that gradually become accepted and practiced. Look at the progression. This is how things are done here. Then everyone does it. Then it is only a small favor. Then no one is harmed. And finally, we have always done it this way. This is how ethical consciousness is slowly anesthetized. Imagine a new employee entering an agency. On the first day, someone says, technically, this should go through the normal process. But this one comes from the office of someone important. That employee feels uncomfortable, but else seems calm. So the employee complies. The second time, the discomfort is smaller. The 10th time, it feels routine. Eventually, the employee may train new staff to do exactly the same thing. And now the deviance has become culture. Notice what has happened. Nobody issued a formal policy saying favor powerful people. The practice is transmitted through habit, through signals, through stories, through what senior people reward, through what everyone knows but nobody writes down. This is why institutional culture can be more powerful than written rules. The manual may say one thing, the lived institution teaches another. And this helps explain why simply adding another code of conduct does not always solve corruption. The institution may already possess excellent rules. The ethical problem may lie in daily micro behaviors. Small gifts accepted, minor shortcuts tolerated, informal favoritism, quiet manipulation of schedules, selective enforcement, special access. Each individual act seems significant, but together they teach the institution what is actually permissible. The slide warns that institution must examine everyday behavior, not merely wait for major scandals. Because by the time the major scandal occurs, the ethical deterioration may have been developing for years. This gives leaders a different responsibility. Do not merely ask, has anyone committed a major violation? Ask instead, what small practices are we normalizing? The question may be more important. But if corruption becomes cultural, then we cannot explain it only by saying there are bad people. The next slide forces us to examine both persons and systems. On the one side, we see bad people, character failures, individual greed, personal vice. On the other, bad systems, weak controls, concentrated authority, institutional vulnerabilities. And in the middle of is the overlap where personal vice meets system gaps. That is often where corruption flourishes. This is important because reform efforts tend to make one of two mistakes. The first says corruption is caused by bad people. Therefore, remove the bad people and replace them with good people. Character certainly matters. But imagine placing a very good person inside a system where one official controls everything. Transactions are opaque, audits are weak, conflicts of interest are undisclosed, whistleblowers are punished, and political pressure is constant. How long can integrity survive without institutional support? Character without systems is vulnerable to temptation. But the opposite mistake is equally dangerous. Some reformers says the problem is only the system. Therefore, create more controls, more forms, more signatures, more checklists, more committees, more surveillance. But systems do not operate themselves. People interpret them, people manipulate them, people find exemptions, people decide what to report. So the slide also says systems without character become mechanical and easily manipulated. This leads to the central principle. Ethical governance requires good persons within good institutions. Neither alone is enough. This connects beautifully with everything we discussed earlier. Aristotle gives us character. Public administration gives us systems. Uh, Ethical governance requires both. Good systems support good people. Good people protects good systems. Think of procurement. We need rules preventing conflicts of interest, but we also need procurement officers willing to enforce them. We need audit trails, but we also need auditors willing to tell the truth. We need whistleblower mechanisms, but we also need leaders who do not retaliate against whistleblowers. So, corruption prevention is simultaneously a problem of character, a problem of design, a problem of leadership, and a problem of culture. That is why we need to focus on one of the most common places where private interest begins competing with public responsibility. Conflict of interest. This leads us to conflict of interest. Conflict of interest is sometimes misunderstood. People assume that a conflict exists only when an official has already acted corruptly. But that is not what the slide says. A conflict of interest exists when a public official's private interest may improperly influence or reasonably appear to influence public responsibilities. Notice both parts, actual influence and reasonable appearance. The second dimension matters because ethical public service requires not only actual integrity, but also credible integrity. Suppose a procurement committee member owns shares in one of the companies bidding for a contract. The official says, I promise I will remain objective. Perhaps the official genuinely can, but should the public simply be required to trust that promise? No. Ethical governance must protect both the fairness of the process and confidence in the fairness of the project process. This is why the slide gives us four safeguards: disclosure, reveal the potential conflict, do not wait until somebody discovers it. Transparency should be proactive. Recusal, remove yourself from the decision. This is extremely important. Sometimes integrity does not mean making the correct decision yourself. Sometimes integrity means recognizing that you should not be the one deciding at all. That requires humility. Independent review allows someone without the conflict to evaluate the matter. And finally, documentation. Create records that allow the process to be audited and reviewed. This protects everyone, the official, the institution, the public, and a very useful ethical test here is not merely, am I personally capable of being fair? Ask instead, would a reasonable outsider believe this decision-making process is fair? That is the difference between private sincerity and public accountability. Public service cannot depend only on declarations of personal honesty. Institutions must create conditions in which integrity becomes visible. And conflicts of interest brings us immediately to another powerful human force inside organizations: loyalty. Loyalty and its limits. Loyalty is a virtue, but loyalty becomes dangerous when we fail to ask, loyalty to whom? The slide identifies several competing loyalties that public administrators experience: to superiors, to the organization, to colleagues, to family, to law, to profession, to citizens, and to conscience. Most of the time, these loyalties coexist peacefully, but ethical difficulty appears when they conflict. Imagine your superior instructs you to alter a report. You respect the person. Perhaps the superior helped your career. Perhaps you owe the person gratitude. Perhaps you have worked together for years. Now what? Now what? Personal loyalty says protect the superior. Professional loyalty says protect the integrity of the report. Institutional loyalty says may be interpreted into directions: protect the reputation of the institution or protect the institution from wrongdoing. Citizens deserve accurate information. Conscience says another thing. This is why loyalty can become morally complicated. The slide reminds us of the danger contained in the phrase, I was only following orders. History has repeatedly shown that obedience does not eliminate moral responsibility. A subordinate remains a moral agent. Rank does not remove conscience. And office does not cancel ethical judgment. The principle at the bottom of the slide therefore matters greatly. The highest loyalty of the public servant is not personal loyalty to an office holder. It is loyalty to lawful public purpose and the common good. Notice how this transforms loyalty. Ethical loyalty may sometimes require saying no to a superior. It may even require protecting the institution from its current leaders. Because loyalty to an institution is not the same as loyalty to every person who temporarily occupies an office. This distinction is vital. A leader comes and goes. A public institution exists for a lawful purpose beyond any single office holder. So when loyalties collide, the ethical administrator must ask, what is the legitimate public purpose of this office? What does the law require? What does justice require? What does the common good require? Those questions must outrank personal indebtedness. And sometimes following those questions leads to one of the most difficult acts in organizational life. And what is that? Whistle blowing. Whistleblowing is difficult precisely because both sides may represent genuine values. The slide identifies the tensions clearly: loyalty versus accountability, confidentiality versus transparency, organizational unity versus public interest, career security versus conscience. That is why whistleblowing should not be romanticized. We sometimes tell simple stories. The whistleblower is courageous. The institution is corrupt. Truth comes out. Justice wins. Reality is often messier. The slide warns us that information may be inaccurate. Motives may be mixed. Disclosure may produce real harm. So a whistleblower can be mistaken. A whistleblower can be vindictive. Confidential information can genuinely require protection. National security, privacy, due process, and ongoing investigations may all place limits on disclosure. So, ethical whistleblowing requires judgment. But the slide gives us the opposite warning as well. Institutions that punish all dissent creates conditions where wrongdoing can flourish. This is critical. Imagine an agency where everybody knows if you report wrongdoing, your career is over. What happens? People learn silence. And eventually, wrongdoing becomes safer than truth telling. The slide therefore asks two excellent questions. When does loyalty become complicity? And when does disclosure become irresponsibility? There's no one-line answer. That is why mature institutions require protected reporting channels, internal complaint mechanisms, independent oversight, confidential reporting, anti-retaliation safeguards, procedures for verifying allegations. These allow organizations to distinguish responsible reporting from reckless disclosure. And phenomenologically, we should remember that whistleblowing feels like from the inside, or what whistleblowing feels like from inside. It is rarely abstract. It may mean reporting your colleague, your mentor, your superior, someone who helped you, someone who can damage your career. That is why whistleblowing leads us naturally to a quieter ethical problem. What if you do not participate in wrongdoing, but simply remain silent? The ethics of silence. This slide asks a disturbing question. Is silence ethically neutral? Suppose you know procurement is being manipulated. You do not participate, you receive no money, you falsify no document, but you know. Or perhaps you know that harassment is occurring. Reports contain false information, resources are being diverted, and you say nothing. Have you done anything wrong? This is morally difficult because silence is not always cowardice. The slide rightly says that silence may sometimes be prudent. Perhaps the information is uncertain. Perhaps speaking immediately would destroy an investigation. Perhaps there's a safer or more responsible channel. Prudence matters. But silence can also become permission. If everyone knows and nobody speaks, wrongdoing becomes structurally protected. And this is one of the most important observations in the slide. Institutional wrongdoing often survives because large numbers of decent people do nothing. That sentence changes how we think about institutional ethics. An ethical organization does not require everyone to be corrupt. It may require only a few people willing to do wrong and many others unwilling to object. This is why ethical culture depends heavily on bystanders. What happens when someone hears an inappropriate instruction? What happens when somebody notices manipulated data? What happens when a junior employee is mistreated? Does anyone speak or does everyone think, not my problem? Silence can communicate. This behavior is tolerated. That is why the hardest question appears at the bottom. What do we owe the truth when speaking carries personal risk? This is not theoretical. Public administrators may genuinely risk promotion, assignment, relationships, reputation, or employment. So, ethics must never trivialize the cost of speaking. But neither can public service simply declare silence morally harmless. Some institutions or some situations impose a responsibility to act. And when acting carries risk, a new virtue becomes necessary. The virtue of moral courage. Ethical leadership requires moral courage. And we need to distinguish moral courage from physical courage. Physical courage confronts physical danger. Moral courage confronts social, professional, political, or institutional danger for the sake of what one judges to be right. This kind of courage is common in public administration, though it often appears quietly. Let's look at four examples. opposing a superior, when instructions are unlawful, unethical, or harmful to the public interest, this can be enormously difficult in hierarchical organizations. To disagree downward is easy, to disagree upward requires courage. Reporting irregularities, bringing evidence of wrongdoing to appropriate authorities through legitimate channels. Notice the phrase legitimate channels. Courage is not necessarily theatrical. Sometimes courage is methodical, documenting facts, following procedure, preserving evidence, reporting responsibly. Next, refusing a bribe. Protecting institutional integrity despite direct personal pressure or threat. We often imagine refusal as simple, but sometimes the bribe is not offered crudely. It may appear as a gift, it may appear as a favor, an invitation, an opportunity, a future opportunity, a relationship. Moral courage sometimes needs to distinguish which is which, no? And that is important because we need to be able to see what makes us who we are. And finally, telling uncomfortable truths. And this is also very interesting. Sorry. So, uh, so informing citizens, legislators, superiors, or colleagues of realities they may not want to hear. This may be one of the most difficult duties of senior advisors. The ethical advisor is not a person who tells the leader what the leader wants to hear. This may be one of the most important duties of senior advisors. The ethical advisor is not the person who tells the leader what the leader wants to hear, but that what the leader needs to know. And the slide clarifies this beautifully. Courage does not eliminate fear. Courage acts responsibly despite fear. That is important. Courageous people are not necessarily fearless. Sometimes they are very afraid. They simply refuse to allow fear to become the final authority over their judgment. And even courage is not enough by itself. A courageous person can still be impulsive. A whistleblower can still be reckless. A dissenter can still be mistaken. So the next slide will introduce another Aristotelian insight. Moral courage must be guided by prudence, or as we've said, phronesis. On the previous slide, we ended with moral courage, the willingness to act responsibly despite fear. But now we introduce an essential qualification. Moral courage is not recklessness. It is possible to be courageous and still act badly. Imagine that I discover something troubling inside an organization. I immediately post documents online. I accuse people publicly. I disclose confidential information. I say I am courageous because I am exposing wrongdoing. But several questions remain. Is my information correct? Have I verified it? Could innocent people be harmed? Are there legitimate mechanisms through which the matter should first be addressed? This is why the slide joins courage with prudence. Recall our discussion of Aristotle's phronesis. Prudence is not courage, it is practical wisdom, the capacity to discern the appropriate action within a concrete situation. The slide gives us several questions that should discipline moral courage. First, is the information accurate? Before I accuse another person, what do I actually know? There is an enormous difference between suspicion, hearsay, inference, and verified evidence. Ethical action begins with truth. Second, have internal remedies been attempted? This does not mean internal mechanisms must always be exhausted, regardless of circumstances. Sometimes internal channels themselves may be compromised. But the question must at least be considered. Third, who may be harmed by disclosure? This is important because ethical action does not occur in a vacuum. Disclosure may affect innocent employees, witnesses, families, ongoing investigations, institutional credibility, or even national security. Fourth, what public interest is at stake? Excuse me. This may be the most important question. And something that we have to reflect on. Am I speaking because the public genuinely needs to know? Or because I am angry? Because I want revenge? Because I want attention? Mixed motives do not necessarily invalidate truthful disclosure, but ethical maturity requires us to examine them. And finally, is disclosure proportionate? And are there lawful reporting mechanisms? The slide concludes with a very useful information. Moral courage without prudence may become self-righteous. Prudence without courage may become cowardice. Ethical leadership requires both. That is an important balance. Courage asks, will I act? Prudence asks, how should I act? Courage prevents ethical paralysis. Prudence prevents ethical recklessness. And together, they reveal something deeper about moral decision making. Sometimes There is no perfectly clean choice. And that brings us to one of the most difficult problems in political and administrative ethics, the problem sometimes called dirty hands. Can a leader ever be morally required to do something normally considered wrong in order to prevent a greater evil? Political theorists call this one the problem of dirty hands. The phrase itself is revealing. The leader acts, but does not emerge morally untouched. Consider the examples on the slide. An intelligence official receives information about an imminent attack, or government has sufficient medicine during an epidemic and must decide who receives treatments first. Interesting, right? In ordinary circumstances, we want government to protect everyone. But what happens when protecting everyone is just impossible? Suppose there are 1,000 patients and only 200 doses of medicine. A decision must be made. Whichever principle we adopt, someone will not receive treatment. If we prioritize the sickest, others lose access. If we prioritize those most likely to survive, the most vulnerable may feel abandoned. If we prioritize frontline personnel, we privilege social function. If we use a lottery, we sacrifice medical prioritization for procedural equality. Notice what happens here. The administrator is no longer choosing simply between good and evil. The administrator may be choosing between competing goods or between alternatives in which every available choice carries some moral laws. This is what we call moral remainder. Even when the best available decision has been made, something valuable may still have been lost. This is an extremely important insight for public leadership. We sometimes imagine that if a decision was ethically correct, the leader should feel completely satisfied afterwards. Not necessarily. Some ethical ethically defensible decisions should still hurt. Why? Because real people may have suffered. Sometimes genuinely valuable may have been sacrificed. And this leads to what the slide calls the ethical discipline. The leader must not become morally numb. Tragic choices should remain tragic. This is profound. The dangerous leader is not necessarily the leader who struggles with difficult decisions. Sometimes the dangerous leader is the one who no longer struggles. The person who says, that is simply the cost. Those are just numbers. Some people have to suffer. The capacity to feel the moral weight of a decision is not weakness. It may be evidence that One's ethical sensitivity remains alive. So the question becomes, how do we think systematically when different moral values collide? So far, we have examined character, corruption, loyalty, whistleblowing, silence, courage, and tragic choice. We now need intellectual frameworks that can help us analyze these dilemmas carefully. And we begin with things you might be familiar with already. Several frameworks for ethical judgment. And the most important sentence in the slide is that no single framework is sufficient for the full range of moral complexity encountered in government. That point must be emphasized. In ethics, we are sometimes tempted to search for a formula. Give me one rule, give me one principle, give me one test. Then I will always know what to do. But public administration is rarely that simple. One framework may ask what consequences will follow. Another asks what duties must be respected regardless of consequences. Another will ask who is vulnerable, dependent, or in need of care. Each sees something important. Each also risks overlooking something important. Imagine a relocation program for a major infrastructure project. Consequential reasoning may say millions will benefit. A duty-based approach may ask, were the rights of the displaced families respected? A fairness approach may ask, who bears the burdens and who receives the benefits? Virtue ethics may ask, what kind of administrator are we becoming through the way we treat affected communities? Care ethics may ask, have we actually listened to the concrete experiences of vulnerable families? Same project, but different ethical lenses. This is why doctoral level public administration requires more than knowing ethical vocabulary. We need what we might call ethical fluency, the ability to look at the same situation from several moral perspectives, not because morality is relative, but because moral complexity or moral reality is complex. A single framework may illuminate one dimension while leaving another in shadow. The slide will help us to examine these approaches one by one. And we begin with perhaps the most familiar form of reasoning in public policy, judging actions according to their consequences. Consequentialism asks us to evaluate an action by examining its outcomes. And public administration uses this kind of reasoning constantly. Which program will help the greatest number of people? Which intervention will save the most lives? Which allocation produces the greatest public value? Which infrastructure project will generate the largest social benefit? Or which policy reduces poverty more effectively? These are consequentialist questions. The slide recognizes that consequentialist reasoning is deeply embedded in public policy. And this makes sense. Government cannot ignore consequences. A policy that sounds morally admirable must predictably produce widespread that but predictably produces widespread suffering cannot simply dismiss those consequences. Consequences alone cannot determine morality. Consider the example provided. A development project may produce enormous national benefit, while displacing an indigenous community without consent. Suppose the government says this project will benefit 10 million people while only 500 families will be displaced. From a purely numerical perspective, the calculation may seem obvious. 10 million outweigh 500. But ethics asks, can the rights of the 500 simply be erased because they are fewer? Can human dignity be reduced to arithmetic? Can a minority be sacrificed whenever the majority benefits? This is the danger of unrestrained consequentialism. The minority may become invisible. The weak may repeatedly carry the burden because sacrificing them produces the greatest aggregate benefit. The slide thereby concludes consequentialism is necessary but insufficient. We must consider consequences. But consequences must be weighed alongside rights, dignity, fairness, duties, and especially the interests of those least able to protect themselves. So, ethical public administration asks not merely how much good will this policy produce, it must also ask, what are we doing to persons in order to produce that good? That question takes us directly to the ontology. Where consequentialism focuses primarily on outcomes, the ontology focuses on duty, principle, and respect for persons. The slide draws specially from Kant. The central principle is that a human being must never be treated merely as an instrument for institutional goals. Notice the importance of the word, not merely. Public administration inevitably asks people to participate in collective projects. Citizens pay taxes, employees perform duties. Communities accept certain restrictions, but persons cannot simply be reduced to tools. The slide gives us three applications. Due process. Government cannot say, we know this person is probably guilty, so why waste time on procedure? Due process is not an administrative inconvenience. It expresses respect for persons. Every citizen deserves fair procedures, not merely outcomes that administrators consider desirable. Truthfulness matters. Suppose an agency manipulates statistics because officials believe the program itself is good. They may reason, if people so if people lose confidence in this program, funding will disappear. So we need to adjust the numbers slightly. A Kantian test asks Could I rationally will a universal rule saying that all agencies may falsify data whenever they believe their purpose is good? Obviously not. If everyone did this, public information itself would become meaningless. Second, consent matters. People possess moral worth. Therefore, procedural justice cannot simply be sacrificed in the name of efficiency. This is especially important in democratic administration. Citizens are not merely populations to be managed, they are persons, rights bearing subject, participants in local community. So the ontology places a moral boundary around administrative efficiency. It tells government there are certain things you cannot simply do to people, even if doing them appears administratively convenient. But this creates again another question. What if our procedures themselves are formally equal, but the institutional arrangements remain unfair? That leads us actually again to Rawls and the issue of fairness. John Rawls shifts our attention from isolated actions toward the fairness of institutions themselves. The slide introduces his famous thought experiment, the veil of ignorance. Imagine that we are designing the rules of society without knowing where we ourselves will end up. We do not know whether we will be rich or poor, healthy or disabled, urban or rural, part of the majority or minority. Now we design the institution. Would you still create the same rules? This is powerful because ordinary policy making is often influenced by our existing position. If I am wealthy, a policy may look fair from the perspective of wealth. If I live in Metro Manila, resource allocation may look reasonable from Manila. If I belong to the majority, protections for minorities may appear excessive. Rawls asks us to imagine ourselves without knowing where we will stand. Suppose you are designing access to public hospitals. You do not know whether you will be wealthy or poor, urban or rural, able-bodied or disabled. What system would you design? Suppose you are allocating disaster funds. You do not know whether you will live in the capital or an isolated island municipality. Would you still allocate resources in the same way? This is why roles matters enormously for public ethics. The slide tells us that ethics concerns not only individual actions but institutions. A leader may personally be kind, personally generous, personally honest, but that leader may still administer an unjust system. That distinction is crucial. Good intentions do not automatically create just institutions. So, Rawls forces the public administrator to ask, are the institutional arrangements themselves fair? Not, am I personally a good person? But would these rules still appear just if I do not know what position I would occupy within them? That is a much more demanding ethical question. Rawls moves from the morality of individual administrators towards the justice embedded in structures. From there, the lecture will continue by asking what kind of persons must inhabit these structures and what kind of moral character public leadership basically pushes forward. And that's the point of the next lecture that we're going to look at. From here, I'll call it end, and thank you very much for listening.